This video will shock you. After learning about what I know here, my life hasn't been the same. I think about what I talk about in this video on a daily basis. If you don't want to know this, turn back now. That being said, I know that by saying that, this is gonna make all of you watch this video. I know this advertising tactic here is shameless, but it doesn't stop it from being true. To be honest, I want us all to know about this, partly so that I can share the weight of this, and also so that hopefully we can do something about it. You'll understand why I say this by the end of the video. I'm already shocked that only a very small percentage of the people I talk to know about this, and I'm already talking to people who are much more aware, educated, and intelligent than the general public. I love this painting. The way it works is that some people see an old lady, others see a young woman. Life is like that, where we all inhabit the same world, but we all make out different patterns to explain it in terms that are comprehensible to us. My goal for What If Altist is to let people who are looking at this painting see both images at the same time and explain which one of these interpretations I believe to be the most correct. I try to share other ways of looking at it even if I don't agree. That's why I explain the worldviews of each civilization and era of history. By the end of this video, you will start looking at the movie that is our lives in a completely different way. In my own personal life, this feels like a plot twist at the end of a movie, which changes its entire meaning. While the world is spiraling out of control, sometimes you just need to tune everything out for a bit and listen to some good music. And today's sponsor, Raycon, can help you with just that. Raycon is a quality product that I use every day when I go on walks or just want to jam out for a little bit. They're half the price of the other premium audio brands for amazing audio quality. Raycon earbuds fit perfectly. I'll sometimes forget I have them in, and with 8 hours of playtime and 32-hour battery life, I can use them whenever I want. Given my work, it's awesome to have high-quality earbuds that allow me to focus on making quality content. Raycon is a great product at a great price, and for my viewers, Raycon is offering 15% off your next set of earbuds. So support the channel and click the link in the description, or go to buyraycon.com/whatifaltist to get 15% off your Raycon purchase, plus free shipping. Part 1, Universe 25. As a side note, before we start, I gave my word in this poll that my next video would be about the CIA discovering the spirit world. I'm going to postpone that for one video, since I feel as if I need to read these two books before I can do the topic justice. I always have an intuitive sense of when I can know enough about a topic to make a video about it, and I honestly just haven't hit it yet with that topic, but you have my word that it's going to be the next video coming out after this. This video pulls on the least source materials of almost any video I've done. One of the recent videos I've made is explaining modern civilization. I pulled on 68 books as sources, which is something like 25,000 pages. For this video, the main source I'm using, although I reference many other books which you'll see in the description, is less than 10 pages, that being the Mouse Utopia study itself. There's so much to unpack in each page that it'll take me a second to go through all the interpretations possible. Mouse Utopia was a study in the late 60s and early 70s in Maryland. This was the era of the most rapid population growth ever, and people were really worried about what the implications for that might be. This was the era Soylent Green was made in. Thankfully, the 20th century has dodged all the crises it expected to have, whether nuclear war, overpopulation, oil depletion, and more. I wish our society was collectively more grateful that we dodged so many bullets, but we're not a particularly wise culture. Keep in mind that as we go forward, this is the best argument for why this won't happen, that we've had so many crises before that just didn't occur. The guy who ran this experiment, Calhoun, did this thing in a bunch of cases. The test which became famous was Universe 25. This universe was the biggest and lasted for years. However, all the previous experiments had similar end results to this on a smaller scale. What they did in Universe 25 was put 9 mice into a cage with infinite food and no disease. It was cleaned regularly, had no predators, and a perfectly temperate climate. These are ideal conditions for population growth. The test was designed to create the most perfect optimal conditions for increasing numbers. What happened initially was exactly what you would expect, that the population grew incredibly rapidly. The population doubled every 55 days. The mouse population plateaued around 315 days. By that point, the mouse population was around 2,000, where the cage was designed to hold something around 6,000, so not even close to total capacity. Upon that point, birth rates went down and stabilized. After this, things are going to get very, very strange. The mouse social structure started to break down on every single level. Both mouse sexes converged. Male mice became effeminate. They started secreting feminine hormones when tested. There became this class of male mice who showed no interest in mating, but would groom themselves daily. The scientists called these the beautiful ones. Male mice lost any masculinity and kinda stopped doing anything to maintain the mouse social structure. The beautiful ones don't really exist inside mouse social relationships. Rather, their entire lives were in what amounted to isolation and just self-grooming. The urine the beautiful ones excreted showed chemicals demonstrating intense stress. The thing is that they largely weren't, in that they weren't under too many actual external pressures. The process of permanently being hormonally stressed was taxing on their bodies, and thus they were unable to really do anything else. Mice communicate through urine and scent, thus through this they were demonstrating their immense inner pain and stress to the other mice around them. Female mice became very aggressive and very masculine. They started raising the baby mice incorrectly, kicking them out of the nest too early. They became incredibly aggressive to their young, even attacking them. This created generations of numb mice who were not properly socialized. They were completely unable to interact with the world or socially. The female mice lost interest in breeding and raising families, just like the males. Many female mice started living in isolation from the rest of the mouse community, hiding away in far-off parts of the pen, showing no interest in family or mating. Calhoun liked to say that the mice became autistic. This was in the 60s, before autism was a buzzword either, and autism was much less common back then, so if he said it, it really meant something back then. They lost the ability to interact socially. He called this the first death, or a spiritual death. He saw that the mice had no joie de vivre, or joy of life or reason to live. The life force was just sucked out of them. He said this happened far before their actual numbers started to collapse. Mice live much like Andrew Tate, with alpha males keeping harems of females who raise children. Thus, with all these factors going on, what you're effectively seeing was a breakdown of the ability for mice to coordinate on a group level or breed at any level. This chart creates a useful breakdown of the different kinds of mice you saw emerge as society fell apart. You saw a group of mice which were obsessed with social approval. They wouldn't eat unless they saw other mice eat. They would all cluster together in the center of the cage, even though there was lots of space on the outside. Their gender roles collapsed, and they were constantly driven by stimulation from other mice. They basically became adrenaline junkies through social approval. A second group just went numb. They stopped interacting with the society. They only went out at night. They lost interest in interacting with other mice socially. These mice basically became zombies. They wandered around like the homeless. They let themselves get casually beaten up and hurt by other mice since they just lost any will to live. The third group of mice became incredibly aggressive. They would wander around in packs and randomly attack and target other mice for what they didn't really see as any reason. They would torture and bite up other mice for fun. They would attack any mice that were still having children and trying to maintain the mouse social structure. They were sexually hyperactive, but not for any reasons of actual procreation. As the birth rate collapsed, this group were really the ones which destroyed the mouse colony, killing any who tried to maintain social norms or continue the species. What happened with this is that in each of the 30 experiments, the mouse colony completely collapsed. The mice just stopped having children, and this crashed their numbers. The mice who did try to keep going were killed by mobs of evil mice. After day 1700, there were absolutely no mice left. A couple outtakes before we move on to the next section. First, I'm surprised at how advanced the mouse social structure was as I read this. I'm frankly surprised that mice have a society at all. When you see these things scurrying around your house, you don't really think about them having a cultural system with different expectations that can experience social collapse in the same manner we saw with the fall of Rome or the Mayans. Authors like Joseph Heinrich or E.O. Wilson talk about how culture is fundamentally genetic and dates back deep into our animal roots. That's very clear to see here. Mice aren't particularly smart, but except for one thing, their neurological structures aren't fundamentally that different than ours, except ours are much, much larger. Mice and us both share the lizard brain, which controls for automatic functions like breathing, sleeping, or fear. Then we both share the mammal brain, which controls for things like love, affection, jealousy, and emotion. As humans, we have a much, much more developed prefrontal cortex. That's the region that governs self-discipline and planning. What this means is that automatic functions we don't really think about are pretty similar between mice and humans. We both feel love, horniness, hate, and stuff like that. This creates continuity between us on the instinctual parts of this process. When we see this mouse society fall apart, it's not a mental choice on the mice's part. It's a chemical shift which makes them not want to associate with other mice, effeminate, or not want to breed. This stuff is lodged in the lizard and mammal brains which we share with mice. The part where our brains differ from mice is that we have the ability to plan, think abstractly, and make choices. The mice are effectively creatures of instinct in that the choices they make in life are what they're wired from birth to do. For us humans, our giant brains allow us to be neurologically wired in a bunch of different ways due to culture. If humans had our mouse utopia, we'd be capable of noticing what's going on and adapt to it. These mice can't. Calhoun tried to create new mouse colonies and new experiments which encouraged creativity to see if creative thinking could offset the failures of the colony. He was surprised in some of these experiments to find mice that would pick up a habit of tunneling for fun and making balls of dirt as a hobby as a sign of mouse creativity in a collapsing, crowded society. I've read conflicting reports on how well this works. I think it forestalled the social collapse for some mice without stopping the process. To be honest, the idea of using creativity to offset complete social collapse is such a late 20th century idea. As a person born in the 21st century, I'm always shocked by that era's ability to think we'll find some magical MacGuffin through love, creativity, the power of friendship, or technology, so as to not deal with some vast systemic social issue. I remember hearing all that kind of thing as a child, with friendship is the answer or follow your dreams from adults around me as a kid. Then my generation got shafted. Well, none of that was actually useful advice. A point I'd like to make is that although these experiments were replicated many times by Calhoun himself, they never were by anyone else. People take this as a dunk on saying the experiment isn't valid. I think that is a factor to be aware of. However, keep in mind the vast majority of scientific experiments are never replicated ever. What's normal is that when they are, there's only a 50% chance of it working. And in some fields like psychology, only 0.07% of experiments are ever replicated at all. As a side tangent, this is actually a really huge problem in our society in which some fields, like again psychology before, could be completely fake and we'd have no idea. This is a huge issue in physics, where entire theories of fundamental nature for how the universe works are based off one or two inconclusive experiments, which people then extrapolate outwards with math. So vast parts of the fields of physics could be completely fake. When you see your local news station talk about some study that says chocolate in small doses is healthy for you, alternately how in school they taught you carbohydrates are healthy and lean meat isn't, what happens here is that some special interest pays for the results of a study. It never gets replicated, and then it becomes social policy. Thus our society is managed by pseudoscience, pushed by the powerful, and here's like 10 examples of this as a text wall. However, complaining this experiment hasn't been replicated is kind of silly in my opinion, since it's like saying the moon landing hasn't been replicated. To fund lots of people working on a project like this for multiple years straight, as Universe 25 took 5 years to complete, is a miracle in itself. Things that expensive are very, very rare, let alone funding a replication experiment where universities almost never fund replication experiments, and their rankings are assessed predominantly by research. Thus, there's no incentive to put lots of money into replicating an already expensive study that would be difficult to get funding for in the first place. The fact that Calhoun has run various versions of this experiment around 30 times itself is incredibly impressive, and that's something you almost never see. Part 2. If mouse utopia were to happen. I like to ask this question. If mouse utopia were to happen to us as a human society, What would it look like? One of the top principles I use to figure out what the truth is to ask the question, if blank were to be the case, what would it look like? From that, I compare what that would be to the reality that I see to see if that's the fundamental causal principle. For example, I see lots of political dissenters say that America's a dictatorship. However, we still have journalistic freedom, we're not genociding ethnic minorities, we still have some rights, and a two-party state with a competitive electoral system. Thus, I see that the scenario doesn't match the hypothetical. Thus, we're not a dictatorship. If a human society were to have mouse utopia, the first step would be there would be some massive breakthrough, likely technological, in which the population rapidly balloons. This would be an era of profound optimism. This sort of thing would have never been seen before in history. Thus, this society would develop a concept that it was inherently special, and, like nothing before in history, was comparable. This is very similar to our concept of modernity, which I talk about in this video, which I think you should check out afterwards because I believe it to be one of my best. In this video, I talk about how modernity is defined as the rejection of previous societies. Modern people believe that none of the rules or values that took thousands of years to develop over history are useful. This is useful and necessary for the rest of mouse utopia since it's the main preconception that allows all of the other crazy factors to emerge later down the road. If people have a sense of being rooted in the past, then they have a standard to assess themselves against, where it becomes impossible to get them to do all the crazy stuff which occurs next in mouse utopia, since they can compare themselves to the thousands of years of history before and think, what's going on now is crazy and unnatural. The first step is that you need to remove a continuity with the past in order to see the later changes. Most negative changes start by seeming unimportant or reasonable, or very often necessary against an even worse thing. Income tax was installed in America as a way to pay for the world's wars. It seemed reasonable as a way to fight off this giant external threat. However, the government kept the top income tax at 90% for decades after the war for no real good reasons. You start smoking cigarettes to get through a point of stress, and then you find yourself hooked for years afterwards, even when you don't need them. With the cultural changes implicit to mouse utopia, the previous cultural traditions tethering that society to the earth would probably be removed first, since they seemed mean. I can understand that. Societies in eras of harshness often develop very harsh moral codes as a way of keeping the population tough so the society survives. Women need to have kids, not follow their dreams of being an artist, as the population needs a strong birth rate so the neighboring group doesn't outbreed and conquer them. Your sons need to be tough so that he can fight or survive famines. You need to have strong sexual mores to build up tension and incentive for young men to work hard for that society. Once you remove those external threats, removing those standards seems kind. Without external threats, with the looming threat of plague, war, or famine, morality changes drastically. In a society of scarcity, morality is responsibility. You have to plan outwards, since if you don't, your society is going to collapse. Your children will die, or your people will be enslaved. Thus, morality is the act of behaving in a manner which makes sure you and your people survive. However, once you remove the external threats, morality will morph into just being kind. Without the threat of dying, the most moral thing you can do is let people follow their dreams, not rocking the boat. In this system, the old code of responsibility looks oppressive. The only moral code left is permissiveness, acceptance, and kindness. A point I want to get across is that we overestimate the power of the conscious mind in our society. We think humans are inherently rational, and that if there's an issue, that we can rationally decide to change it. That every problem in human population is from a conscious choice made. This is why when we see, let's say, disparities in income between the sexes or races, we assume it's due to oppression, rather than thinking, could this be due to historical, cultural, or genetic factors? The reality is the exact opposite. That the human mind is only very thinly conscious, with us controlled by giant subconscious wiring, which controls almost all of us, that we barely control or understand. We forget how much circumstance, genetics, or upbringing change how we think. For example, I've struggled with PTSD. There are points where it feels almost like a switch goes off in my brain and I become incredibly paranoid. I'll rationally know I'm fine, but I'll emotionally feel like I'm dying. It can sometimes look as if the light in the room is changing. As I get more stressed, the lights literally get darker even though I'm in the exact same place. Then I'll take a cup of kratom, a Southeast Asian supplement which counteracts PTSD. Within a second, my thought process changes completely. I can suddenly think about what I'll cook for dinner or what book I'll read next. These are neurological changes which I can't control, but completely change how I think. You see neurological and hormonal changes, which we have no control over, massively influence how we live our lives on a very profound basis. When I'm sick, I'll get depressed and I can't plan for the future. I purposely have a policy that I'm not going to make life choices when I'm sick because I just have no faith. When I used to live in the Yucatan or Thailand, the heat changed how I thought. In the hotter climate, I had trouble having initiative, being creative, and I stayed up late at night. The thing with Mouse Utopia is you're seeing instinctive subconscious shifts among the mice, which humans would then rationalize. We live in a society of rationalization, not rationality. We just believe random stuff, and there's not really a logical explanation for a lot of it, but we rationalize it somehow. To be blunt, can anyone explain to me how the trans movement makes any sense logically? I've never gotten a real answer to that question. Whenever I ask people for an answer, they just say, we should accept whatever people believe. But that's not rational. Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman?, where no leftist activist could even define what a woman is, demonstrates that. I've lived with some crazy people in my life. My mom had several different mental illnesses at the same time. The thing with crazy people is they don't put a sign on themselves saying, I'm crazy. Crazy people are completely assured that they are correct in their ideas and that everyone else is completely wrong. You tell someone is crazy since they're clearly disjointed. Their ideas don't connect into a cohesive whole. They start somewhere, stop, say something else completely unrelated. None of their ideas flow together in a coherent, rational manner. Sometimes crazy people can have a point. Ted Kaczynski clearly had a couple bolts loose in his head, but I think parts of the Unabomber's Manifesto are absolutely brilliant. What this means is that if we had a crazy society, we would never know. If you're worried about being crazy, you're probably not crazy. If you believe whatever strange idea flows into your head with complete certainty, then you might be. A crazy society would vilify those who fought against it while demanding to insert its craziness everywhere. A crazy society would be viewed as the rest of the world and other cultures as, those guys have got some issues. I cover this topic in much greater depth in my video on the psychological Black Death, which is also one of my favorite videos. This is a much bigger topic than I give it credit for here, but 20% of our population has a diagnosed mental illness now, and among people my age, it jumps to over 40%. Almost all young people statistically have at least one big psychological issue. And I think these numbers are undercounts. This is the case for our society. We operate with all these ideas that don't exactly fit together. We use rationalizations to push social agendas. Another crazy person thing is the inability to see the world in perspective. For a brief reality check, our society literally doesn't believe in truth, logical consistency, reality, or that the past has any lessons to teach us. I took a course in gender studies. This is stuff the left, which really runs our society, will all openly admit to themselves, as I say in this text wall. This is stuff they say they do. Can someone explain to me why that's not the definition of insanity? Women become more masculine in a post-scarcity society, given as a general rule the weight and difficulty of pregnancy and having children, which is the most pronounced in humans of almost any species, means that men have to bring something else to the table. Since women have to spend 9 months pregnant and then raise the children for decades, the man brings resources and works to support the family to counteract that. This is a normal arrangement across all societies in human history. However, in a society in which there isn't scarcity, men don't really have a purpose since there's no way a woman and her children will starve or will be attacked. What this does is give all the leverage in sexual relations to women. Society then becomes very feminized. Women get tired of men since the men don't really offer them anything, since resources are no longer an issue. This then results in women becoming agitated and angry at men, while also themselves becoming more masculine as they are now independent and no longer have to rely off men. Without external threats, there is no need for men to be masculine. Men become manly to hunt, fight off invaders, farm, and other difficult tasks that women generally can't do. The other thing is that since women aren't willing to sexually negotiate with men, it creates no incentive for men to be masculine. This then results in a decline in masculinity since being masculine doesn't bear any sexual reward. This creates compounding recursive effects in which, as neither sex has to struggle to make themselves attractive to the other sex, it reduces sexual interest. When men aren't masculine and women aren't feminine, there's no desire for baby making. This then becomes a negative cycle in which it self-reinforces until society falls apart. Both men and women get more resentful of the other, acting out in different ways as a form of taking revenge for the collapse in mating. I spent a long time thinking over this video. I was trying to figure out all the logical structures you could use to explain Mouse Utopia. I came to the conclusion there are very many. I think it won't be until Mouse Utopia is finished that we can tease out what the exact causal mechanism that drives it. It could be that mammal brains can't handle extreme population density. This is why cities are always population sinks, which have moral degeneracy, and for no part of human history, even in the ancient or medieval worlds, had sustainable birth rates. Perhaps we need to have interpersonal relationships in order to maintain morality. Once you remove that, you get too much free riding. Our urbanization is a big reason bureaucracy is so important in our society. The modern world is the most bureaucratic era ever, and it's also the only majority urban period ever in history. What that means is that we can't use interpersonal judgment to maintain standards. The village elders, local feudal lord, and parish priest can't know the character of everyone in the village. Instead, we use bureaucracies and test-taking to manage our society. The problem here is that tests can't assess the reality of the human condition. They leave out traits like morality, courage, honor, or wisdom. This then creates an incentive for a degenerate society. We didn't evolve to be an urban species. Also, there's the incredible loneliness that comes from modern industrial urban societies. Study after study has shown that interpersonal relationships are the most important factor for happiness and social well-being. In an anonymous urban society, this problem gets really acute. 90% of Gen Z feels lonely, and you could say that this results in complete social breakdown due to loneliness and poor socialization. Mammals aren't like ants or insects, which are naturally urban, because mammals need love, companionship, and that sort of thing to survive as a basic biological need. And those kinds of relationships get difficult to maintain when population density gets too high. Then you have the argument that without external threats and challenges, people just fall apart. Imagine a video game where you start with infinite hit points, currency, and weapons. Your video game character would just turn into a complete degenerate who would just mess around out of boredom. The entire society would turn into Grand Theft Auto. Keep in mind, the vast majority of people are selfish, dumb, and foolish, especially so without societies that socialize them to be better. Without external pressure, society collapses into degeneracy. Complicated historical events often occur for many different reasons, operating on many different levels at the exact same time. An easy example of this is the fall of Rome, where you can find loads of justifications for it between climate change, changes in military technology, diseases, changes in military structure, or Spengler's cycles of history, or moral degeneracy. And the thing is, these are all factors operating at the same time that are bundled together into the same process. And this is occurring with Mouse Utopia, where you have all these different factors working together. And there's an interesting theory that has some evidence behind it called the Gaia hypothesis, in which people believe that the natural order, or the planet, is self-regulating and is a single ecosystem in the same manner that the human body is. And what I could also see Mouse Utopia as being is nature's way of self-regulating to prevent single species from taking over and destroying the ecosystem. And so once one species gets too close to destroying the entire ecosystem, their birth rate collapses and they go crazy as a way to keep them from destroying the entire body. One of the aspects of human nature that the Bible touches on, which I think is brilliant, is that human societies can very easily evolve to hate goodness itself. We have souls and know what is good in our hearts. Degenerate societies start to hate goodness weakness since it's a standard that they can be held against. This is how mouse utopia can collapse into complete nihilism. This is why bands of mice go around killing the families of those who choose to continue to procreate and continue society. A fourth possible origin is that we all know women get more emotional than men. Even feminists admit to this by now, but they say it's a positive thing. Power corrupts everyone. If you give any group total leverage, they will turn evil. And the mouse utopia mating market, which gives women total sexual leverage due to resource abundance. The problem is that you turn society into being about emotions, and then complete insanity ensues. The more you try to please your emotional whims, the more insane you get. Emotions are to be understood and tamed, not to rule. If you completely followed all of your emotions all the time, you would be incapable of functioning. However, we now live in a society based off emotion, which is very clearly self-evident if you just look outside. It's also literally what the left says they do. In our society, we have this ideal of fairness, of giving 50-50 to both sides. And the reality, though, is being fair is saying the truth. And we don't actually follow this ideal because it's only applied when you criticize the left, and our society very frequently criticizes the right at all times. And people will say, Rudyard, I don't like how you're going after the left in this video, but the question I would ask is anything I said incorrect? And can you disagree with any of the points I made about the left being nihilistic and all that sort of thing without just having a gut reaction? The thing is, it's not dramatic if it's true. If mouse utopia happens, it will completely change how we see the world. Civilization will spend centuries or millennia trying to reconcile what went wrong. Much is the same which has occurred with the fall of Rome. We will have to develop entirely new philosophies and religious updates to come to terms with the social lessons of mouse utopia. The problem with mouse utopia is that as society descends into it, it's very hard to explain to the population what's going on. That means you end up with a situation in which this catches the society when it's blind and slits its throat in the night. This is since if our society has not experienced mouse utopia before, they just don't have a word or even a concept for it. What this also means is that there's no big or stark events which scream out, the world is changing. It's all very gradual. What would happen if mouse utopia were to happen is the society would gradually just go crazy. The public wouldn't realize what was happening until it had already occurred. Enough of the population would be insane that there would be no recognition of its insanity, and only a handful would notice. Something I find worrying is that in mouse utopia, the violent nihilists were the ones who organized into bands to slaughter those who were still functioning and having children. What that tells me is that more likely than not, the government would be on the side of the chaos of mouse utopia, not fighting against it. Part 3. Comparisons. I look back on the predictions I make each year and compare them to how I saw the world before. I do this to analyze my track record to figure out what kind of biases I have. One of the things, comparing how I predicted the world in 2020 to where we are in 2024, the biggest thing which surprised me is I wasn't able to predict the sheer nihilism of what came next. You can watch some of my older videos and I talk about how I predicted the left would go crazy. That turned out to be correct, but not in the way I thought, and I'd like to draw attention to it. The thing is that I thought they'd be like Mao or Stalin. We have a track record for what the left going crazy already looks like. What surprised me, though, is its nihilistic bent and hatred for life itself. The old left was very optimistic and progressive, thinking utopia was around the corner. The old left supported technological progress, increased population growth, family, and all that sort of thing. The modern woke left has no positive vision of the world in the future. It's just don't do blank. It's purely negative. Some older people might not believe me here when I say the left is openly suicidal, but to just go through the list, the modern left wants to degrow the economy, they view having children as immoral, they are bringing in millions of immigrants to commit what they openly say is effectively civilizational suicide, they are printing the most money of any period ever in Western history, they are tearing down the statues of their great leaders of the past, blackening their nation's greatest accomplishments. They say they want to destroy their societies. Can anyone find a single way the modern left is not committing social suicide? On top of all of this, people say that none of this matters, which blows my mind, given the left today controls almost all of the whole Western world, with the tech industry, film, media, academia, government bureaucracy, churches, and corporations. A suicide cult runs our entire civilization, and we can't bring it up in polite conversation. Our society is killing itself, and I'm not supposed to say anything. If I make too much noise, I'm a doomer. I'm 22. I'm stuck here for the rest of my life, hopefully. For those who haven't seen my other videos, I'm not an unalloyed supporter of the New Right. The New Right has many horrible disadvantages, namely its bloodthirstiness, intolerance, and sociopathy, but the reason, to state my own personal bias that I'm right of center, is at least the New Right's not trying to commit social suicide. The thing is, I couldn't find a comparison to the sheer suicidal nihilism of our culture anywhere else in history. Modern society is definitely decadent. Decadence is a natural process which occurs in every civilization, as I talk about in this video. Decadent societies such as Rome, Greece, India, China, or Islam see collapsing birth rates, degenerate values and sexual practices, an inability to coordinate well, wage war, no will to live, collapsing art or intellectual standards, and a disconnecting the elite and populace. Decadence is mouse utopia on a moderate level. When I look at scientific studies, one of the metrics I look at to assess how plausible the results of that study are to see how much of the rest of history would agree with it. It's my opinion that if you put Aristotle, Isaac Newton, Confucius, and Jesus in the same room, and if they agree on something, that means it's probably true. If a study comes out saying men and women are psychologically the same, I'd really need a lot of evidence to support it, as every society ever in history would treat that as completely insane. The thing with mouse utopia is it fits a framework that we've seen very commonly across human history, that being decadence. This makes me inclined to believe that it's possible. The thing is that historically there has never been a society as rich as the modern Western world since World War II. That means that there were constraints against mouse utopia. There's a bunch of things that are only happening in our society. Our decadence is on a completely different level. As a general rule, the wealthier a society, the worse its decadence. And so does it go to believe that if our society has a completely different level of wealth and comfort than previous societies, that we would not experience a greater level of decadence? As a culture, we've completely thrown out religion, art, history, philosophy, social standards, relations between the sexes, where feminism at the highest rates in history, and our society is committing suicide, as I said before. We don't even make movies or popular music anymore. Think about that. Our society has stopped doing anything of what societies do. Degeneracy at this level is unprecedented over history, except for mouse utopia. I hope over this video you've drawn the line that the only mental model which explains the direction our society is going through is mouse utopia. This is the first time feminism dominated society. There were earlier periods of more female empowerment, but none of them reached the levels of feminism. This is the first time societies are importing immigrants to purposely replace their own population. This is the first time the elite makes satanic art. Doesn't the fact that any criticism of women in our society is called sexist and is not allowed socially just show that we live in mouse utopia, where one of the preconditions is women getting more masculine and aggressive? The fact that I will probably get pushback for making this video, doesn't that show that we're already at a point where mouse utopia controls our society, where you can't even talk about it? We've started seeing the depressed male shut-ins called NEETs or hikikomori. NEET stands for not in education, employment, or training. NEETs would have been unimaginable 5 years ago. I didn't think they were real even 3 years ago. Why are we defunding the police? How does that possibly benefit Black people who often live in unstable communities who really need the police so society doesn't fall apart? This corresponds to the rise in violence seen with mouse utopia. If you look at the teen girl heartthrobs today, don't they look suspiciously like human versions of the beautiful ones? These aren't men who will fight off the neighboring tribe or farm. Once you remove masculinity from breeding, you've removed any conception of using breeding for procreating. The Hindus predicted an age called the Kali Yuga, in which it would be a spiritual dark age. Kali is the goddess of feminine destruction. It would be the feminine burning down the world out of pleasure while no one could reach God. The Hindus knew what we're living through now. This is part of a theme where I have a text wall here, where the Hindus knew a lot more about the world back in the ancient world than we give them credit for. The marriage and birth rate is collapsing at an unprecedented speed. There's again nothing like this before in history. If we look at the countries where this is happening the fastest, in East Asia, such as Japan, Korea, and China, their birth rates are plummeting towards zero. They keep on falling lower and lower, where they approach just having no kids. There's no stabilization going on here. The horrible thing is that this is a process which is being seen almost everywhere in the world. The only countries with stable birth rates today are the poorest in Africa. Almost no one, even in Latin America, India, or the Middle East, has stable birth rates now. Again, nothing like this has ever been seen before in history, and the only parallel is mouse utopia. If we look at Japan, the country where these factors have been driven the fastest, birth rates have completely collapsed. Japan is one of the lowest birth rates in the world. Women are in the workforce and don't want to get married. There's a social class of men called hikikomori, or herbivore men. They aren't interested in sex and just stay at home and play video games. Nearly half of Japanese men under 40 are virgins. That's also self-reported, so the real numbers are probably higher. Japan is already in mouse utopia. Other countries are catching up. I think back to modern feminist culture, which hates the idea of any man treating a woman sexually in public. If a man so much as glances at a woman at the gym, hits on her in the street, or work, or acts dominant, he can be cancelled. The thing is that women like when men are dominant or aggressive. What I've seen in the subconscious of modern feminism is it literally loathes the idea of women breeding with men and being happy starting families. The thing is, why does our society care so much about this? Women aren't children. They have agency and can politely reject men, and if they don't take a hint, pepper spray or shoot them. All of these cultural changes we've seen are occurring on what's really a visceral biological level. The left has thrown away all rationality, and they literally admit that proudly. They just say, this is what feels right. That's exactly how you would rationalize the hormonal changes which underlie mouse utopia. The thing I see with the feminist movement is there's no thought. If men can't talk to women at the gym, work, or public, how the hell are the sexes supposed to meet and make the next generation? The real reason for this is that feminism loathes the idea of procreating and finds it disgusting, so they try all of these different methods to avoid it. A few months ago, I was looking at in modernity, we kind of just destroy social institutions without replacing them with anything. We'll just lose codes of politeness, intellectual standards, religion, art, and more, and no one notices. Nothing replaces them, just degenerate garbage architecture and streetwear, which is incredibly bad. This isn't normal. When the Greco-Roman culture died, it was replaced by the Christian. When the Mesopotamian civilization fell, the Persian rose. I started viewing our era as a behavioral drain. I then looked up that word and saw behavioral sink, which is a term from the mouse utopia experiment. I realized mouse utopia is the only explanation for what's going on now. Part 4. What do we do? Man, this is such a hard question. I've honestly been thinking about this every day. Now that I've figured out a mental model which can explain the problems in our society, I can't unsee it. I honestly do believe this. It's the only way I can explain a resolution to the problems going on now, which have no other parallel in human history. How else do you resolve the complete plummeting in birth rates, the collapse in social values? How do we as a society resolve how a very significant amount of the population, especially those in power, are insane people trying to commit civilizational suicide? I don't want to be like one of the people who gets too depressed around climate change, and past a certain point, you have to keep your theories and your intellectual ideas out of your daily life of work, friends, relationships, or washing the dishes. That being said, I am yet to see Miami or New York City sink underwater, and almost every factor in mouse utopia is already swinging. The internet is not a good place to be vulnerable, but I see my realization of this as a duty from God to do something about it. Our society is already getting eaten alive by it, and the establishment is too complicit in it to notice. We need to start doing this so our civilizations and everything we love survives. We all saw what the end of this experiment looks like. We can't afford to have our mouse colony fail. Look at everything Western civilization, and frankly from the birth rate numbers, all the other civilizations have accomplished. Imagine if we have to restart with tribes in the Amazon or Congo. The good news is that we as a species are capable of planning and rational thought. We can control our impulses, band together, and and survive. We need to do this to survive. Again, I'm 22. I can't pass this on to my descendants since I'm stuck here. Even if we rage against the dying light, we'll forever be known as those who stood when we needed to, not those who went mad and committed cannibalism, burning their own civilization down. One of my favorite fantasy novels is the Quorum series by Michael Moorcock. It's set in a fantasy world where the gods of chaos have won. They then start destroying entire races and sinking continents beneath the sea out of boredom. The thing the book talks about is a little bit of chaos is very creative. A lot of it is completely destructive, as the areas run by the chaos gods for the longest become uninhabitable deserts as chaos needs a structure of order to operate in. There are 6 kinds of people in this novel where the Chaos Gods win. Some become fanatical cultists who worship the Chaos Gods. Some become numb zombies who can't handle what's going on. Others become savage, sociopathic barbarians. Another group copes by becoming normies who can't admit it. Others become crazy from the chaos. A final group are a small group of people trying to hold civilization together and beat the Chaos Gods. I see this split today in our society, especially among people my age. The final group of people need to organize, unite, and fight for the survival of civilization. I think the popularity of zombie movies is a sort of collective subconscious foreshadowing of Mouse Utopia. The zombie apocalypse is a lot like Mouse Utopia. To be honest, each generation I see more zombies. Gen Alpha doesn't seem to have hobbies, independent, or an ability to function outside of iPads. This might make me sound crazy, but when I look at the TV today, something's off. People look like puppets. They don't move their eyes enough. Their neck posture isn't right. They don't move their arms enough. It's like the spark is gone. It's the first death which Calhoun talks about. There are 3 things that can forestall Mouse Utopia. The first is communities of those who are sane living together in out-of-the-way places. They can protect each other, farm, maintain sanity, and operate independently from the rest of society. They should test and purge any members who demonstrate signs of chaos corruption. They will be like the monks who passed on classical learning through the Dark Age until the revitalization of the Middle Ages. The second thing is that we can't afford for the forces of chaos to maintain control over the government. If they have control of the military, they will use it like the gangs of vicious mice to kill those who continue to procreate and survive. This is the only scenario where you could see complete extinction of the American nation or other world nations. We need the orderly to maintain control of society so that society can survive. The third is that we need a revitalization of religion. If you look back over history, God is the only force strong enough to maintain sanity and order in a world that's going crazy. The only thing strong enough to pull together the forces of order and keep them sane in the inevitable horrors that will occur is faith in God. Things will get better eventually, for evil is unsustainable. Evil burnt itself out. All of this being said, I know I'm sounding dramatic. I am open to being wrong here. Most of the time when people preach doom, it just doesn't happen. That being said, the reason I support this theory, as I said before, is it's the only mental model which can explain why our society is so nihilistic. Also, it has lots of historical proxies beforehand, like the fall of the Maya, Rome, the Han Dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, and more. Society has collapsed many times before in history. The reason I went so hard on this video is that in case I'm wrong, the sunken cost is at worst my reputation gets trashed. At best, I get the word out and we can start reacting to these issues. If this is going to happen, we need to do something about it. There's a good science fiction book named Fitzpatrick's War. It was written in the 90s and is set in the 25th century. What happens in Fitzpatrick's War is that over the course of the 21st century, the world's population peaks at 11 billion. Then society collapses into complete degeneracy. American and global culture becomes completely dysfunctional, nihilism, ghetto, and trashy. Then groups of rural Americans start living in the countryside away from it all. The religious fundamentalist rednecks are called Yukons since they're so rural and hickish, a comedian says they might as well be in the Yukon. In the 2060s, America has a civil war between inner city gangs who seize control of the central government and the Yukons. The Yukons win and burn all the major cities. Plagues ravage the world, whose population resets to 10% of what it was before in the early 22nd century. The Yukons recreate the English-speaking world as a rural Christian fundamentalist Anglo-Saxon monarchy. The Yukons create a secret social club of historians who try to engineer society towards the laws of history. The Yukons become obsessed with history to avoid recreating the crisis of the 21st century. The Muslims populate all of Europe while the Chinese repopulate East Asia. the world in Fitzpatrick's War is brutal. I won't deny that. I do admire the author's ability to show a pretty plausible scenario for how Mouse Utopia might play out in actual human history terms, not in the lab. I don't think the author ever heard of Mouse Utopia. This was a pretty obscure experiment until recently. I think he picked it up on an intuitive basis. Also, Fitzpatrick's War is one of the very few science fiction novels which accurately matches what human history looks like into the future. It's a future which looks a lot like the past, and fundamentally the only thing we have to study what the world might be like in the future is the past. When all's said and done, we're humans, not mice. I hope I'm wrong. That would be better for all of us. If my reputation gets trashed and humanity survives, that's a great outcome. I don't want to turn into a right-wing male version of Greta Thunberg. I don't want to have this video make you all so depressed you don't go to work tomorrow. That being said, we need to at least be thinking about this and taking it seriously. I wish you all the best, and I hope to God we'll be fine.